Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here in Astana again, just as the winter is setting in. English people are not very used to the snow, and so if you see me on the floor later, then please just ignore me and I'll carry on. Thank you to Carol for that introduction. I'm here to talk to you about the development of history teaching in England in the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. But I'm very much interested in taking the experience of changes in how history is taught in England and beginning to use some of those ideas to better understand the way in which history is taught in Kazakhstan. And I'm very interested in the Kazakhstan history curriculum and how that is developing at the moment and the way that history is taught in schools here. And so particularly at the end of my seminar, I'm very interested to hear from you and any experiences you have of learning history or teaching history within Kazakhstan. And if anybody would be interested in collaborating with me in the future on this, then I would also be very pleased to hear from you indeed. And I taught in comprehensive schools in England for about 7 years. And during those 7 years, I was very committed to the teaching of history, but I was also very interested in the way in which history is taught at a more general level. I became interested in national debates about the teaching of history. I became interested in changes to the curriculum, changes to pedagogy. And I want to share with you today some of those discoveries and experiences that I had. I want to begin by picking out a few key debates in history education. These are the things which, no matter what country you go to, people seem to get really, really upset about. And I'm not just talking about academics in a university. These are often public debates which are played out across the media, across newspapers, across television. Parents come into school and they sit down and they say, "Why aren't you teaching my child this?" Or "Why are you teaching my child this?" So I want to highlight what I think are some of those big questions. And based on my reading of other countries, my expertise is in the UK and England specifically, but I've read quite a lot about the debates in other parts of the world, and I think that the debates I'm highlighting here are far from unique to England. The first and perhaps the most important is this question of whether or not history is a national story. To what extent do we want children sat in lessons in school to learn the national story of their past? Often that's associated with pride in the country, perhaps with nationalism, perhaps with encouraging children to learn to love their country. There may be a citizenship agenda playing along there at the same time. The problem with that is that, for historians you will know this well, for non-historians you probably know this, there's always more than one way of telling the same story. And you get different interpretations of the past, different perspectives on the past. And the question which has always troubled me is that if you teach one national story to children, and then they walk out of the classroom and they hear a different story, a different version of events, a different account, then what are they going to think? They could think, "My teacher was lying to me." I think that's quite a big problem. They could think that there's no truth in history. They could end up in some kind of postmodern apocalypse where we can't believe the truth about a single thing in the past. Well, I don't think that's acceptable either. But if we're only teaching a national story, one narrative of the past, then actually we have problems there in terms of what children are taking from school. So there's a question there for teachers of history about how competing narratives of the past can be handled. How does a teacher in a classroom deal with the fact that the past can be interpreted in different ways? I've added on here as well what I think really characterises the debate in Britain. And this perhaps is more unique to Britain, but I don't think completely so. I've already spoken about how history teaching is often about developing pride in your country, national pride for where you live. But certainly in Britain, there's been strong arguments that maybe Britain's history should be about an apology. Should we be apologising for things that we did in the past? Germany is a classic example of this. If you go to Germany today and look at what they learn about the Holocaust in schools, then there's a real sense there that as a nation they have something which perhaps they should apologise for, even though those people who took part in those events are now nearly all dead. I'll come back to that in one moment. The third way of thinking about it is to say, well, maybe if we're not going to tell one story of national pride, but we're also not going to feel guilty about our past, maybe we need to take a step back as historians. Maybe we need to say we need a sense of perspective, a bit of distance. Maybe we shouldn't be so caught up in the pride of our past or the apology of our past. Further questions which emerge in other places are about what history you teach. I think for most of human history, for most of the past, humans have written about leaders. If you go back to Thucydides or Herodotus writing in ancient Greece, they were interested in leaders. They were interested in decisions that politicians made, that kings made. But as we move into the 20th century, history began to change, and people said, well, maybe we are interested in more than just the rulers of society. Maybe we are interested in the people they ruled over. So maybe we are interested in studying people who are not in charge. Maybe we're interested in studying peasants and farmers, people living in cities. Maybe we're interested in studying the middle class. Maybe we're interested in studying women. Because actually, for most of history, historians have mostly been interested in writing about men. Not always, but generally speaking. Perhaps we're interested in minority groups. In England, the majority of people who live there are white. They call themselves English, or possibly Welsh or Scottish in other parts of the UK. But of course we have minority populations in Britain and in every country. And I do not need to tell an audience of people from Kazakhstan that every country has diversity in the people who live there. And there's a question of, do you study the majority population, or do you give time to minorities? Do you give more time to minorities than is representative of their place in society? Then there's a question about how far out you go. I don't think anyone really thinks that you shouldn't study the history of the country in which you live. I think there's near universal agreement that if you live in Kazakhstan, you should study Kazakh or Kazakhstani history. If you live in Britain, you should study British history. But there's a question of what balance is within that. How far do you go out to study the wider world? Do you study your country in the context of the wider world? Or perhaps you study other places in the world for their own sake? Maybe we want to study Mughal India, not because we're interested in what Britain later does with Mughal India, but because we're intrinsically interested in studying some Indian history. So there are questions there about the wider world. And of course it goes the other way too. Are we interested in local history? Now, in Kazakhstan, a country of such geographic size, a question about what is local history becomes very, very interesting indeed. But even in England, a very small country, there is a lot of emphasis on studying your local area. If you live in London, should you be studying the history of London? If you live in York or in Edinburgh, should you be studying the history of your local area? I think many people would argue that when people speak of teaching English history, what they really mean is the history of the South East. Finally, and this is an argument which has parallels in many other subjects as well, there are questions over the nature of the knowledge that we want to teach. Are we interested as history teachers in teaching about propositional, factual knowledge of the past? Should pupils be learning kings and dates and battles and events and what happened? Or should there be a focus on procedure? Should the emphasis in school history be on how we learn about the past, the methods of the historian, the different ways in which we can go about gaining propositional knowledge? I'm going to return to that later. I'll give you a couple of examples from Britain, and I want to return to this issue of pride and apology. This map that you can see here was produced in Britain right at the beginning of the 20th century. It shows the empire, the British Empire, as it was in 1886. And the areas which are coloured in red are the bits which belong to the British Empire. And every child in a British school would have looked at a map like this and they would have said, isn't Britain Great Britain? You know, Britain ruled the world. Britannia rules the waves. There's a real emphasis in here on the peoples that Britain ruled over. Whether we're talking about North America, South Africa, the Pacific, in India. But there's also a real emphasis here on trade. Isn't Britain the great trading nation? Look at all the wonderful things that it sells. Look at the trade routes on the map that connect up the different parts of the empire. If we're teaching about British pride, we teach about battles in which Britain was victorious. This here is a painting of the Battle of Waterloo, with the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, in the middle of the picture.
This is a battle which comes up again and again when people say we need to teach about our national pride, because the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 was the last time that the British finally beat the French, and the French haven't beaten us since then, and of course, therefore, we should be proud of that fact. And even in the face of great adversity, some people would argue that we should teach history because it shows, what's the best way of describing this, British grit. The fact that people in Britain carry on no matter what. This is a photograph from 1940 when London was being bombed by Nazi Germany and all around the buildings have been destroyed in the bombing. But you know what? The British people get on with it. They make sure that no matter what, someone delivers the milk. This is an idea of, it's creating an idea of Britain and what the British stand for. So images like this are the kinds of images that people who think that teaching history should be about national pride really like to see in classrooms. Compare it to this one. This is a sketch from the 18th century, late 18th century, which shows a British slave ship. Many European countries were involved in the slave trade, but Britain had a major role in this. And every year, ships would set sail from Glasgow, from Liverpool, from Bristol, to head down to Africa, where they would pick up black slaves, take them across the Atlantic on the Middle Passage to North America and the Caribbean, and sell those black people there into slavery to work on sugar and later cotton plantations. Now, that's not a particularly pleasant part of British history. But is it something that we should be teaching children? And if we are teaching children about the slave trade, should we be teaching them so that they feel guilty about it? This is something which we're not very happy about, that our ancestors took part in, even though they've been dead for 200 years. What about this? This is a painting of an event in 1857, although I think it's actually 1858 when this took place. This was an event which in England at the time was called the Indian Mutiny. It was when people in India rebelled against British rule. In India, they don't call this the Indian Mutiny. They call this the First War of Independence. The British put down the Indian uprising, and they punished some of the leaders by taking them and strapping them to the front of a cannon and then blowing them to pieces by launching a cannonball through their breast. This was called being blown from cannon. Something else which, as a British person, you might look at that and think, I'm not very happy about what my ancestors did in the past. Is it the job of a history teacher to point to these things and to get children feeling bad about this? Well, these are the kinds of questions which have come up in Britain and other parts of the world again and again. Now, I'll return to some of these towards the end and think a little bit about how we might handle those. But being a historian, and historians in this room will probably understand this, I think that if we want to understand something, we can get to that understanding by studying its past. So I'm afraid I'm going to give you a little bit of history now to better understand the way in which history is taught. And I'm going to do that by taking you through a few developments in how history was taught, what was on the curriculum, how it was assessed in English schools across the 20th century. So, I'm going to skip over that for now. I want to begin this story in 1944. In 1944, a law was issued called the Butler Act, and it was probably one of the most important laws in the history of education in Britain because it introduced compulsory schooling to the age of 15 for everybody. And in particular, this Education Act created a tripartite system. What that means is that after 1944, all children in England at the age of 11 were supposed to be divided into one of three schools. They either went to a grammar school, which was a selective school. It was aimed at the top roughly 20-25% of children in terms of academic ability, however you want to define that. It had the technical schools, which were designed to be more vocational, more focused on craft, on engineering. And the secondary modern schools, which were for, broadly speaking, the lower 50%. In reality, we only ever really had two, the grammar schools and the secondary modern. So by the time we get to the 1950s, 60s, about 3/4 of English children were in these secondary modern schools. Now, if we look at history and where history was being taught, in the independent schools, the private schools, and in the selective grammar schools, history was very strong indeed. I'm not necessarily saying it was taught well, but children did study it. And they studied it for 3 years, for 5 years, maybe for 7 years. And although I might now look back on that curriculum and not feel very happy about what they learned, the fact of the matter is that these children, the top 25% in terms of ability, were learning history. For the rest, this was not the case. History was seen as an academic subject and seen as not very useful, really. Why should children learn about history if they're not going to go on to some kind of further study, if they're not going to be involved in politics, if they're not going to go to university? And it was seen as hard. I would agree, history is a hard subject. And those two things combined were really quite damaging for history for most children in England. If it's irrelevant and it's not important and it's hard, then you've got a toxic combination, which means that history is not really going to be studied. And what we see over the course of the 1950s and 1960s in England is fewer and fewer children studying history in secondary school. Sometimes history was merged into other subjects, things like civics or social studies, but studying history as an academic subject really was disappearing. History was nearly dead by the time we get to Mary Price's famous article from 1968, in which she criticised where history was in the secondary sector. Now, I'm going to put this in the context of some other changes that were taking place. In the 1960s and 1970s in England, in terms of the wider education system, people became increasingly unhappy with the tripartite system. People believed that the grammar school system, the selective schools, were not socially open. It was only the middle-class children who got to go there, and that it was not giving good opportunities to the 75% who didn't go to the grammar school. And so, for better or worse, England shifted to a comprehensive school system. And by the time we get to the late 1970s, the vast majority of schools in England had become comprehensive schools. I think there were about 160 grammar schools left. But this raised a really difficult question. What do you do with all those children who had been in secondary modern schools, who were now going to comprehensive schools, and who were expected to learn history? You know, there was now a requirement that all children should be learning some form of history. And it was believed that the old history of the grammar schools was not really appropriate for these children who were coming out of the secondary modern schools. So people started to play around a bit, and they thought, how can we change history, change the way history is taught, to be suitable for these pupils? Now, in England, the big shift took place under something called the Schools History Project, which began in 1972. And the Schools History Project really turned history on its head. And it said the old way of doing history, with kings, with battles, with politicians, with white men, is out of date. And it said we need to change what we do with history. We need to make history more relevant. We need to make it more interesting. This so-called new history contained the following things. It focused on the longue durée, the long periods of time. Rather than studying small events, it said, let's take a step back and look at big changes over time. With that, of course, went to focus on social and economic history. There was a very large emphasis, on source analysis. Historians in the room will know that historians work by getting contemporary sources, taking those contemporary sources, those speeches, those diaries, and so on, and reading those and using those to construct the story of the past. Well, the Schools History Project said, you know what, maybe that's what children in schools should be doing too. They should be reading sources, using sources as evidence to make meaning about the past. The Schools History Project brought along an emphasis on local history and said that all children should have the opportunity to study the history of their area. Remember, this is about making history relevant, making history worthwhile. If I'm walking down the street and I see a particular old building, I should know about what the history of that building is. That's the kind of logic behind the Schools History Project. Now, this became very, very popular indeed, and lots of schools began adopting this way of teaching history, but the crucial thing came in British education reform in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But two key things happened. The first thing was that we got what are called GCSEs, a set of exams, and secondly, from 1991, children were being taught a national curriculum, which all children in the country were legally required to study. And those ideas from the Schools History Project, the study of sources, the study of long periods of time, of social history, of women's history, of local history and the historical environment, were placed right at the heart of the GCSEs and the national curriculum. Old history was dead, new history triumphant. This new way of teaching history had really come out on top. But of course, nothing in history ever really comes to an end. Things go round in cycles. And in the 1990s, there was growing dissatisfaction with this new form of history. People started looking at this, and interestingly, I'll come to this later, teachers really started looking at this. And they were increasingly unhappy about how history was being taught in schools. They didn't like the fact that children were no longer really getting a good grip on chronology. They couldn't really explain how things had changed over a long period of time. Some people were particularly unhappy with the loss of focus on political history. But the thing which really upset history teachers was how sources, documents, were being used in the classroom, and particularly the kinds of questions that were being asked. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I've got a speech written by Winston Churchill in the Second World War. Children would be asked in an exam, is this source biased? We're all happy with what I mean by this word bias. I think that's a fairly common word. But it's a word that history teachers these days really, really hate. And they really hate it because children would go into an exam and they would read a speech and they would write, this source is biased. Therefore, this can't tell me anything. This is just someone's point of view. And there were other similar questions which reduced history to simplistic answers which didn't really mean very much at all. After all sources are biased. It's not the fact that it's biased which makes it interesting to the historian, it's what that bias tells you about the period. So people were becoming very unhappy with this. I think as well, there was a growing emphasis here on where propositional knowledge was needed. If you're going to study a document, if you're going to study something that someone has written, you need to know an awful, awful lot about that person. You need to know about the context in which they wrote. You cannot do analysis of sources unless you have a very deep understanding of the period itself. You've got to know an awful lot before you can then begin analysing documents. And I think people were beginning to recognise that this rejection of propositional knowledge and this the what happened in the past and this focus on procedural knowledge, how we go about deciding things in history, had gone too far in the other direction. Now, this was coupled with a whole range of other changes, which I won't bore you with, but I think they probably do have parallels in Kazakhstan as well. There were a whole range of new things which started to come into education in Britain in the 1990s and 2000s, which took this problem and made it huge. One of those problems was league tables. Now, in England, and I think it's true in many other countries as well, schools are ranked, and parents can look at league tables on websites in universities, and they can say, this school is better than that, based on results. Now, follow the logic through. If you're a head teacher in a school, you want your school to be on top. That means you want your students to get good marks in exams. That means you look very, very carefully at the exam and the criteria for the exam, and you tell your history teachers you've got to make sure that they're meeting those requirements. And because the exams focused on these simplistic questions, because the questions were not, for want of a better word, very historical, this kind of ingrained the problem that was there. Teachers were no longer focusing on developing knowledge of the past. I generalise, but I think that might be true to an extent. Because they had to focus on exam preparation. We had something which had just disappeared called key stage levels, where again there was very little focus on propositional knowledge of the past, and instead children were being told, you've got to make sure you analyse your sources, you've got to make sure that you study interpretations, but without specifying how you could use knowledge in order to do those things. History teachers also were facing a reduction in time. They were being told history, once again, we go around in cycles, is not as important. If you are a student who's not very academically able, surely it's better that you are studying a qualification in hair and beauty, for example, or physical education. And a lot of history teachers found that they were losing students, not because those students didn't want to do history, many of them did, but because they were being told, history's not for you. Instead, you should be doing something more vocational. You should be doing something non-academic. Now, there are arguments on both sides over that,
But for me, I would actually argue that the children who are less academically able are often more in need of good history. These are the types of people who need to have an understanding of the past because they're ones which I would argue are more likely to listen to, let's say, dodgy interpretations outside of school. So, history teachers were faced with all these problems, and we're getting now towards the late 1990s, early 2000s. And history teachers began asking themselves, well, what can we do about this? We're not happy with where history has got to. We've got problems with what's going on in the classroom. And history teachers now began to take the lead on this. Now, I'm the editor of a journal called Teaching History. It's a journal for history teachers, written by history teachers. It comes out 4 times a year. And it publishes about 20 or 30 articles a year written by history teachers. Now, I've only been an editor of that since 2010, but the journal is much older than that. And it's got this very long tradition of teachers writing about history teaching. And what you start to see in the late 1990s and early 2000s is history teachers taking the horse by the reins and saying, let's take this thing called history and let's make it good again. And I'm going to highlight 3 things with which these history teachers seem to concern themselves. The first was about an emphasis on what made a good historical question. Is a source biased is not a good historical question. You don't learn anything about history from asking that question. Here's another bad question. What was so bad about the slave trade? Well, if you can't answer that question, then I think there's something wrong with you, actually. You don't need to know anything at all about history to be able to say what's bad about the slave trade. So teachers said, well, maybe this question isn't right. Maybe what we're talking about here is a causal question. Maybe the kind of question we want to ask is, why was the slave trade abolished? Why did it come to an end? Now, if you read what historians write, yes, they'll tell you some things about the slave trade, but they won't make this question their main one. They might really focus on this one here. And they might say, well, okay, we know the slave trade existed. We know it stopped existing. Why did that happen? What was the transition there? Now, that's a much better historical question. But here's an even better one. Why have historians disagreed about the abolition of the slave trade? Now, the reason I think this is a better question is that it encourages pupils to think about different interpretations of events. The question, why was the slave trade abolished, might just lead students to say, well, it was because of nice white men in the British Parliament who passed a law in 1807 to abolish it. But actually, there are a range of other reasons as well. There are economic reasons for its collapse. There are social reasons for its collapse. There were campaigns by ordinary people to bring the slave trade to an end. And so to ask the question, why have historians disagreed about the abolition of the slave trade, actually forces pupils to recognise that there are different ways of interpreting the past. Think about the demands of the question. You cannot answer that question unless you've got a really deep, rich knowledge of the period itself. You've got to know an awful lot of stuff to be able to answer that question. But this question allows you to deploy that propositional knowledge, those facts, in order to answer something that is very interesting and deeply historical. This ties into something else which history teachers have been writing about recently, which is what is the place of the academic discipline in the classroom? Do we have children over here in school learning history and professors over here in a university researching it? Or is there actually some connection in between? And if there is a connection in between, then where does the history teacher sit in that? So here's here are 3 ways in which history teachers have begun to get children thinking about this. One is to get them reading more. If you read what history teachers are writing at the moment, they're not saying to children, read textbooks. They're saying to children, read works of academic history. And what's really exciting is that this is not seen as something for the most able students. I've watched a number of history teachers in trainees in my own lessons. I have read lots of things written by history teachers, seen people present at conferences on this, where they've taken very academically weak children who are struggling to read, and through a focus on language, through a focus on vocabulary, through a focus on argument, are getting children reading good history. And of course, one of the links we might make here is with getting pupils writing better. Now, I don't know about you, I find school textbooks are generally written very, very badly.
The quality of the language often isn't very great, and it's often very dry. Whereas a really good historian brings the past to life. They use their language and their writing to make history interesting. Now, I don't want pupils writing boring bits of text where I've read them all before. I want pupils writing something interesting. And of course, one way of getting them to do that is being able to see it. You would never teach someone to play the violin and they've never heard a concert. They've never heard someone who's expert at the violin playing it. Well, I would say the same is true of history. I think if you want children to get better at history, they need to see the gold standard. They need to see what they're working towards. And reading history is a good way of getting them understanding what they have to do to produce the better history. And link back to the previous point that I just said, that actually one of the reasons why history teachers in England are getting children reading works of scholarship, works of academic history written by people in universities, is because it gives them something to argue with. I'll be honest here. This is where history, I think, is a bit different. If you go into a maths lesson and you say to your maths teacher, that's wrong, unless the maths teacher's made a mistake, it probably isn't wrong. You can probably rely on a maths teacher to get the maths right. But history is not like that. There are always different interpretations. You can have the two most eminent professors in the world on one subject, and they can completely disagree with each other. So one of the things you want pupils to do is to engage with those arguments, to say, well, OK, if this historian says this, why is he saying this? If this historian is saying this, then why is he saying that? And most importantly, where do I put myself in that? If I'm a child in a school, then I want to be able to say, well, actually, I think this historian hasn't quite got it right, and I'm more persuaded by this argument. The final thing, well, I've just picked 3 things here which I think are particularly interesting, but there are many other things as well. But the final thing for my purpose is that history teachers are increasingly thinking about the relationship between overview and depth. Because it comes back to that old story, that old issue. Do you just teach small bits of the past, or do you teach big sweep-throughs history? Well, what history teachers in England are now starting to say is, well, you know what? Maybe we can have our cake and eat it. Maybe we can have both of those things. Maybe if we spend quite a long time studying something in depth, then that might reveal something much bigger. I'll give you an example. I was at a conference last week, in fact last Saturday, and I saw a history teacher there presenting a sequence of lessons they had done with a pupil, and the question was, what can tea drinking tell us about 18th century society? Now, you might think about it and say, well, that's really small, really boring, and not very important. Who cares about who was drinking tea? Well, actually, if you look at who was drinking tea in 18th century Britain, it tells you about social class, it tells you about the structure of society, it tells you about trade and where that tea was coming from, it tells you about the history of ideas, because a lot of ideas that were emerging at this time in politics, in science, in philosophy, were done in tea shops and coffee houses. So actually, by taking one small depth study, we can use that to zoom out into a much bigger set of ideas. This is something which history teachers are playing with quite a lot. At the same time, I think history teachers are now getting much better at asking about what the outcome is. What do we want pupils to leave school with? Do we want them to be able to list off 20 battles? I'm not saying that isn't important, but is that sufficient? Or do we want them to be able to tell a story? Do we want them to be able to tell multiple stories? What kinds of frameworks of the past do pupils need? So I think that if I'm to summarise developments in history teaching in Britain, I kind of hope that they link into some of those debates which we saw at the start there. I think for me, the most interesting thing is not the changes in the curriculum, not the changes in assessment. I don't think it's the people writing the exams, the government writing the curriculum, or the people writing the textbooks that are actually the really interesting thing. What's really interesting in England at the moment is how history teachers are taking their subject, taking their discipline, and thinking very carefully about what it means for that to become a taught subject. There's a great deal of teacher agency in this. Teachers are taking the lead on this. And over the last couple of national curricula that we've had in England, we've had a very interesting case where the government is responding to history teachers. The government in England has recently issued a new curriculum, and they issued a draft version in February 2013. This is for first teaching in 2014. And teachers said, absolutely not. What the government has given us is a load of rubbish. And there were various other organisations of historians and so on who said the same thing. And it changed. And it changed in part because of the work of history teachers thinking very carefully about what it means to learn history and what good history in the classroom looks like. I want to finish just by bringing this back to Kazakhstan. Because Kazakhstan at the moment is a country which is undergoing considerable reform in education. You all know that. That's why you're here in this building. But history is a subject which is very important in Kazakhstan. I was at the NIS conference in Astana 2 weeks ago, and I went to see a seminar there on the teaching of history. In the Kazakhstan history curriculum, it looks like you've got this distinction between Kazakh history and world history. And that's a very interesting way of handling this division between, is history about learning a national story, or is history about studying the whole world? Now, I'll tell you what I'm really, really interested in. I'm really interested in a school student. I want you to imagine a school student who comes along to school at the start of the day, and they go along to their maths lesson, to their physics lesson, and then they go into Kazakh history. And they learn about history in Kazakh history. And then they go away and they have their lunch, and they come back after lunch, and they're now in their world history class. Now, what I'm really interested in is how do they see those two subjects? Do they see Kazakh history as being completely different to world history? Do they see these two things as complementing each other? And if they do complement each other, then how do they complement each other? How does the local feed into the international? Are there different ways of approaching history? Now, the message I got at the conference 2 weeks ago was that there was a strong focus in Kazakh history on developing national identity. Now, I'm seeing some nods in the audience, which makes me think that that is the case. Whilst in world history, I get the impression it's much more what I would think of as a disciplinary, distant approach, asking questions about other countries without necessarily passing any kind of judgment there. I don't know. Well, what I really would like to find out more about is what's happening for those students who are experiencing these two different history courses and yet, well, going home to their parents at the end of the day and their parents say, "What did you learn in school today?" What those people say about history, I think, could be very interesting indeed. So if anybody would like to talk to me further about that or would like to collaborate with me on looking at that further next year, then I would be delighted to hear from you. But I think I've probably spoken for too long, and I'm really keen that there's some discussion and that there's a chance for questions. So I'd like to say thank you very much for giving me your time, and I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.